Today we'll be looking at the legal status or the regulatory status of the petroleum industry as it is in Nigeria. Are we backward? Are we stagnant? Have we made progress? And are we right to not have the Petroleum Industry Governance Bill signed? We have Mr. Israel Aye, an oil and gas lawyer and expert. It's nice to have you with us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, sir, so let's begin with humanizing where we are in terms of our cash cow, the oil and gas sector. Where are we regulatory-wise, legal-wise for investment?
When we say where are we in terms of investment, and I was just trying to see if I can get specific numbers that I can show to you, perhaps in the course of this conversation. I'll be able to pull it out and share. But in terms of the status of the industry, along the key indices by which the health of this or any industry perhaps is measured, we're performing somewhat poorly. So our production, by and large, are collapsing, and particularly productions from joint ventures in respect of onshore, shallow offshore, swamp productions are declining. So perhaps I should use the word declining rather than collapsing. They've declined by over 40%. Reserves have also declined. They've declined for over 5 years now. And I think the first alarm was sounded when Mr. Lawrence Shala was the director of the DPR, that's the Directorate of Petroleum Resources, was when he started to sound the alarm that our reserves were collapsing. So let me give you a sense of what we're talking about, particularly with respect to reserves. The intrinsic value of the industry is measured by reserve replacement. That's really how the intrinsic value of the industry is measured. And it just then shows that as long as oil continues to be a factor, you have the capacity to produce sometime in the future. That isn't happening. And of course, in order to be able to replace your production and to maintain it and grow it, the national objective is about 3.5 million barrels of oil per day. In order to be able to do so, you also need to undertake new projects, drill new wells, and bring more facilities into production. Unfortunately, none of those are happening. And why are they not happening? They're not happening because we're not receiving sufficient investment into the oil and gas space in Nigeria. And one of the major factors, not the only factor, but indeed one of the major factors for that is the lack of certainty in the statutory and regulatory space.
Okay, so that said, that expressed, what is like the overview of Nigeria, of the regulatory environment for oil and gas right now in the country like?
Well, okay, so it depends on what you mean by the overview we have, so the current, if you will say the overview.
So what if you are given a legal environment macro analysis to an investor and say it now to Nigerians because we are like shareholders, how would you describe it?
Well, so there's an existing framework.
Yes.
Which definitely comprises of the Petroleum Act. Well, on top of the Petroleum Act, what sits above every law in Nigeria is the Nigerian Constitution. And then you have the Petroleum Act, you have the Petroleum Profit Tax Act, then you have all kinds of sundry pieces of legislation that constitute what you might refer to as the legal framework of the petroleum industry. So those exist. But the real challenge is that the moment you signaled to the international community that you are in the process of replacing all of this, what you then say to them is that you effectively have no law. So in that regard, we have what, say from a typical investor point of view, you have three broad scenarios. You have the good law scenario, you have the bad law scenario, and you have the no law scenario. And so Nigeria, you may argue with respect to petroleum industry, is somewhere within the no law scenario, and which is a paradox of sorts, because we have a set of laws that are current, but because we introduced the PIB, we tipped, as it were, into the no law scenario. I don't know if that answers.
Yes, it does. It does express the fact that we are in, will I say, this kind of emergency mode, and we are making adjustments and adjusting the dial. And we've been in that emergency mode for since 2007, 2008, that's about 11 to 12 years. But with the president's refusal to assent to the Petroleum Industry Governance Bill, would you say then that we are still in that no-law scenario?
Well, that's obvious, isn't it? That
I mean, we could then move to maybe the bad law scenario or something.
No, as a matter of fact, the worst case scenario is actually the no law scenario.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's simply this. So if you remember, the way I took the spectrum is good law, bad law, no law.
No law, yeah.
A good law, and again the question is by whose standard is it good or bad? So all those are value judgments.
Yes.
So you can indeed again configure this to maybe just two categories: law, no law, extant, non-extant, and all of that. So, but however you look at it, whether it's a good law, bad law scenario, at least you know what your risk profile is. And the general, call it altruism, in the investment circle is that you can model risks, but you can't model uncertainty, which is what the no law situation creates. So I'll give you an example. I mean, and a lot of people just probably don't get this right. Sometimes the way we carry on the conversation around the petroleum industry is that we hold it at such an esoteric level that people can't connect or relate to it. But here's what we're talking about, that the balance sheet of the Nigerian banking sector combined may not be able to fund 3 big projects. Okay, and this is not something I came to independently. This is something that the experts have generally looked at, and the issues of numbers. But that's not entirely unique to us, right? That, many other climes, not dissimilar to us, look, to the international money market, if you will, or to the pool of funds to be able to attract investment. So just you imagine that any business developer takes a Nigerian project to their investment committee, okay? And then asks for approval to go and start a project in Nigeria, and describes what the prospects are, speaks to them about everything. Just one question will topple this. So what is the legal regime in Nigeria? I can say to them, well, there is this, however, they're in the process of replacing their laws. When is that going to happen? We don't know. Destroys everything. Because investment requires that degree of certainty in order to be able to commit. In the absence of that, it's almost impossible to commit. Because at that point, it's no longer investment. It now becomes gambling.
Baba Ijebu. Okay, but let me rephrase this question now. So the National Assembly have deemed it fit that we should break these bills into different parts and then pass it piecemeal by piecemeal. Now the president has refused assent to the first one. The National Assembly has not sent the other 3. So doesn't it say from the angle of this regime, the Buhari regime now, that they are okay and they are comfortable with the law as it is? Which means that there's probably then no risk or no risk for for investors to model, or no uncertainty rather for the investor to model?
Or rather, no certainty for the investors to model. Okay, so we should really stop pointing the finger and trading blame, yeah, because that's easy to do. You have to remember that it isn't only this government that has failed.
But this is the first
pass.
time. I mean, this is the first time there's a document in front of them, and they're like, "Oh,
And
we don't need it."
That's some sort of compliment to the government in a sense. I mean, particularly to the 8th Assembly, and you'll have to give it that to them. But listen, I think there's the place where we all should take responsibility. That's the point I'm trying to make. You know, and you know, if you remember, part of the conversation we had prior to coming here when we're in your sort of holding facility was that we want more public engagement.
Yes.
Because this is, like you said, we're all stakeholders, we're all shareholders in this business. And I'm just totally alarmed at the complete lack of information, awareness, and perhaps interest by the Nigerian public in this particular space. And even where there is a little bit of interest, the tendency is for us to just sort of engage in what I call, you know, banal banters that does not help anybody. So, listen, here's my take on this: that it isn't only this government that has, if you will, failed to pass the Petroleum Industry Bill. It did not pass under Obasanjo. It did not pass under Jonathan. Under Jonathan, you know, and all of these people, in my opinion, had a lot of goodwill to be able to do so, made little to no progress in terms of passing it. The 8th Assembly, under the leadership of Senator Saraki, took the bulls by the horn and did something about it. But again, it has not passed. The Petroleum Industry Governance Bill, which deals with just a fourth, approximately, of the issues, has, if you will, passed at the National Assembly, both chambers of the National Assembly, but we're still trying to get accent to it from the President. But that hasn't yet happened. So to your question, does it mean that they're comfortable with the status quo? Maybe, maybe not. You know, institutional reforms, which is what the PIGB focuses on, you know, changes a few things. But if you ask me, honestly, I think that there is a fundamental design defect with the entire petroleum industry bill proposition that we need to fix if we're going to see any progress at all.
And what would that design effect be?
All right, so...
Or first off, let's take this question now. What are the key differences, distinctions between the legal framework as we have it, which is headed by the Petroleum Act, and the Petroleum Industry Governance Bill?
Okay, so broadly speaking, you would say that the Petroleum Act, as it currently is, was first made in 1969 or thereabout, and at the time it provided a little more than just a basic framework for licensing, okay, and for the payment of fees, and you know, so it has things around license renewal, license relinquishment, revocation, and the likes of it. And there are a few regulations attached to it to enhance or to support production. But that is not sufficient. I mean, you have to think of it in terms of building a house, okay? It's impossible, I imagine, that you would lay the foundation of a bungalow and midway down the road decide to build a 10-story house. Then you've got a problem. So the thinking generally is that the Petroleum Act as it is does not provide enough, you know, foundation for really building what you might refer to as a petroleum industry. You know, some of us make the arguments that we probably don't even have a petroleum industry in Nigeria. We have an extraction industry, which is fundamentally different from a petroleum industry, because in order for you to have a petroleum industry, you have to have a robust midstream and downstream. Most of the value is created downstream.
Exactly.
Those are the areas where you can engage in, and the general thinking as well is that consumption of petroleum is what creates wealth,
Yes.
not export.
Yes.
So we have a framework for
Export.
win, work, and carry away,
Carry away.
which is in fact the right that is granted under the OPL and the OML, and which is what has happened for well over 50 years.
So sorry, by OPL you mean the oil prospecting license?
The oil prospecting license and the oil mine license.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Again, falling prey to what I said. Yeah, so the oil prospecting license, which is a shorter term license, and then the longer term lease, which is the oil mining lease. The right it grants to you is the right of win, work, and carry away. And which is what has happened, like I said, in the last 50 years, right?
Yes.
To win, work, carry away.
Yes.
Cool. Now, but we're where we are. When we started, when oil was found, probably in the 50s, we were a population of just about 56 million people. Today, the UNICEF tells us that we're about 201 million people. We're headed to be in a population of about 400 million people by the year 2025, if I'm not mistaken, or is it 2050? 2050, I was told, to be in a population of well over 400 million people. That's a population explosion if nothing happens to arrest it. Yet, we have a petroleum industry that contributes very, 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 very minimally to the gross domestic product, which is well around 10 to 15%, and it can do more. So the thinking effectively is that we need to reform. We need to reform the industry to promote domestic utilization, indigenous participation, that is more Nigerians participating in the value chain of the whole thing, and to perhaps deregulate the downstream and create more prosperity, or use petroleum, as it were, oil and gas, to stimulate economic development. So that's the thinking essentially. Now the rest is details, right?
Yes.
So in that respect, you want to reform, if you will, reform and restructure the institutional framework.
So framework. Yes.
You want to you want to renew your rules. You want to update your fiscal provisions, tax royalties and the rest of it, and then better improve your engagement with the host communities, and then reposition for growth.
So, but one major difference, one major add I see is that the Petroleum Industry Governance Bill actually really defines roles. Because if you look at the Petroleum Act, I think it gives lots and lots of powers to the minister, and it even defines roles for the president. But we have a situation where the minister is the president as well, which means he has lots of powers. And we have the government playing in the role as a regulator and playing in the role as an investor as well, as a player or as a stakeholder, like as somebody who wins, works and carries away.
Yeah,
in the commercial aspects as well. So let's just speak to what the country is losing by the fact that the government is regulating itself.
Well, that's probably
because which is the main thing why we need Nigerians to jump on this and say, you are locking us out of the sector, which means probably need to be in government or have government links or ties to be able to participate in the industry as it is. That's why the downstream sector is still closed off.
Okay, I hear you, but it's probably a slight oversimplification of the issues. It's not, again, like I said, with us, it's not unique. Okay, because look, what you guys are doing is absolutely laudable. I like it, and honestly, I'll be happy to jump on board and contribute my 2 pence any day. I.e., just sort of engage the public and hopefully get more Nigerians talking and all that. But with that also comes the responsibility to frame the issues correctly.
Correctly, yes.
And to provide the right sort of information and analysis. So when you talk about government participating in regulation as well as in investment, it's not unique to Nigeria. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. Okay, So there are three key activities that, or there are three sort of key themes that you're looking at. You're looking at policy, you're looking at regulations, and you're looking at commercial activities. Now, the important thing is that there is clear separation of rules.
Exactly.
You know,
Yes.
government is large. So the agency of government that is responsible for policy should not be the same agency that is responsible for regulations. So that's where the issues are, right? Yeah? And it should not be the same agency of government that is responsible for commercial activities.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the way things, rather more by default, and of course by, like I said, just poor infrastructure, legal infrastructure.
Yes.
What you now have is an NPC that has literally stepped up to cover the gap for everybody because they have more capacity. Okay, so in a way, because you don't have a strong back office for the minister, whoever that is, the minister inevitably leans back on the NNPC for policy support.
But isn't this because...
No, if you don't mind,
okay.
for policy support. Now, because of the uncertainty around even how the DPR was created, because remember that the DPR was first created under the NNPC Act, Section 10 of the NNPC Act, I think 1977, right? Because that came out of NNPC, and it is not unusual to take people from NNPC to go and lead the DPR. So again, regulations and policy is mixed. So yes, we end up in a situation where the person who is framing policy, who is regulating the industry, is literally trading in it, and it's all confused. Now, the Petroleum Industry Governance Bill was supposed to separate those rules and place them in. So if you go to Brazil, if you go to Malaysia, if you go to Saudi Arabia and all of those places, you will find government in business. That's not a problem. Just ensure that the Department of Petroleum Resources is different from the from the National Oil Company.
And they all have equal capacity.
Separate rules with capacity and all of that. The framework for that to happen does not exist under the Petroleum Act. It has been proposed in the Petroleum Industry Bill, even though I have to add that the Petroleum Industry Bill failed to tackle the issue of the back office to the minister, because there was no, I think it failed. Let me simply put it that way, because I have been part of some of the conversations in that respect, and people are not willing to take on the civil service when it comes to, creating a petroleum directorate to act as the back office to the minister. But so that's the situation.
But we have the Ministry of, like in the proposed Petroleum Industry Governance Bill, there's the Ministry of Petroleum Incorporated, right? So what would you then mean by a back office?
Okay, so the petroleum industry, the Ministry of Petroleum Incorporated is not an operational organization. Okay. So the Ministry of Petroleum Incorporated is a shelf company that is supposed to hold part of the National Oil Company. It will have no operational capability. It's a holdco with no operational capability.
So the minister just creates policies, but he doesn't have like a project desk and all.
Yeah, that's one way to. That's a good way to put it, actually. Right now, the minister heads what you refer to as the Ministry of Petroleum, but you see, as you and I know, that ministries are not created by law. Yes. Or indeed under they're not created by law. Yes. I think there are a couple or so ministries that are created by law. The Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and a couple or so of those ministries. But by and large, it is the president that determines from time to time what ministries he wants to create. So today we have the Ministry of Petroleum, but the Ministry of Petroleum Resources is an integral part of the civil service. And what it means is that there is transfer of service that happens. We know, for example, that persons have come from the Ministry of Health and have come from the State House, come from various other places to come and head up the Ministry of Petroleum Resources. And as an industry person, sometimes you're at meetings with these folks, you know that they're very brilliant folks, but everything that is being discussed there probably just flies above their head because it's not their discipline.
So finally, let's examine this. What is the opportunity cost? Because you've already expressed all the points. We have a petroleum act that doesn't cover for the entirety of a petroleum industry, just covers for extraction. We have issues of separation of rules. Even with the industry governance bill itself, we have issues of expertise in terms of operation and policy development. What is the opportunity cost to Nigerians? What do you want Nigerians to tell the government, like, this is what we are missing out on because you have made these decisions?
Well, okay, fine. I mean, I think the key message basically for us, and you asked me this question a little earlier, the key issue for us is that whatever stops growing starts to die. We have, as at today, and everybody needs to confront that fact, that reality. We have, as at today, a declining industry. And to just put this in perspective for you, the country that has the highest oil reserves, over 160-something trillion barrels, is Venezuela. Venezuela has the highest proven reserves in the world. But Venezuela's production has collapsed to over under 1 million. As at yesterday, I saw a number showing about 700-something thousand barrels of oil per day. This is a collapse. That is a collapse. It tumbled from over 3.5 million barrels of oil per day to about 700-something million of barrels per day. So what do we have? That's mismanagement. That's poor governance that has created that. What happened in the case of Venezuela was that increasingly, under Chavez, increasingly nationalized their petroleum resources. And so the sent away, and of course you have to lay on top of that, what do you call it now? Sanctions. But that's, if you take that away, and then they sent away investors. And because they did that, their industry imploded. And what is the living condition in Venezuela today? There's poverty, there's hunger. Even if you have money, you can't find drugs in the store, you can't find food. They're now exporting people. And this is easily one of the richest countries in South America, has become a beggarly nation today because of poor governance. My message to Nigerians effectively is that, look, if we continue to have this state of uncertainty over the petroleum industry, then we are headed in one direction. You know, Nigerians are subject to what I refer to as magical thinking. There is this ruling our hand over our heads and say, God forbid, it won't happen to me. And that is where every Nigerian should become interested and become engaged. And my attitude essentially is pass the PIB in some form or shape, all of it, or discard it and do something else. The PIB itself has assumed a life of its own. Everybody talks about the PIB today. But my question is, what should be the concern to us? The concern is, firstly, creating certainty in the investment environment, and secondly, focusing on petroleum industry reforms. That should be the twin objectives that we should be pursuing in the petroleum industry. So we're either passing the PIB now, or we are going back to the international community and saying, you know what, we're no longer going to waste our time with the PIB. We're going to focus on petroleum industry reforms, but this body of laws are the body of laws that we have. Okay? And so you can work with them, and then we'll go into this other mode. That way, you would literally remove the cloud of uncertainty, and hopefully, that along with other fixes will begin to then attract again. So
gradual amendments to the existing laws.
You got it. So effectively, the way you do that is to say, look, thematically, I mean, you can say, what are the things we want to reform? So you look at it. And I'll give you one quick example. In incorporated joint ventures, which was used as a tool to fix,
existing joint ventures,
funding, for example. I remember the first iteration of the petroleum industry bill. It was part of it. And we said to them, what on earth are you doing? Effectively, you're trying to hardwire the terms of an SHA, shareholders agreement, into a law. It doesn't work that way. You don't need a law to transform your unincorporated joint ventures to limited liability companies. You don't. Now they've seen the wisdom. So government is going about it that way now. You know, kudos to this government. You know, they're going about it that way now. So there are a few other things that we propose to do under the PIB that honestly we don't need a wholesale replacement of the laws to do. You know, so let us not be fixated on the PIB. That's my issue. You know, and I'm not going to carry a placard today and say, oh, pass the PIB. It's important to pass the PIB, but the PIB is not the issue. What I'm going to carry a placard for, if I will, is create certainty over the petroleum industry and reform it to create wealth.
And we need to do that fast because it's a finite resource. Less than a century left to go. Thank you very much.
Assuming it will be relevant for a century.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Mr. Ezra, for your time.
Well, thank you for having me.